Hello everyone, my name is Carl, and what I want to talk about today is I want to talk about Mula Nakshatra and the padas, or the four divisions that exist within Mula Nakshatra. Now keep in mind that all the nakshatras have four divisions or four padas, and these energies are ruled by planets, and they in a lot of ways represent characteristics of the particular nakshatra, but also I tend to think of they in a lot of ways represent a life progression through, as the nakshatra matures in a lot of ways. So what we're going to look at specifically is kind of how the energies intertwine here with Mula, and because what we have is we have Jupiter and Ketu. Why Jupiter? Because Mula is at the beginning of Sagittarius. Okay, so Sagittarius is ruled by Jupiter, and a lot of the characteristics of Mula are reflected by this energy. Now Ketu is not really a planet; it's kind of it's a point. The south node of, you have a north node and a south node. The south node, K2 is the body without a head. All right, so I don't want to get into a bunch of details as to what K2 is, but it's related to one's past, right? So it's kind of like your karmic past. So you come into this lifetime with certain karmas, right? And in the case of Mula, these karmas are to be realized as tools, which requires something interesting. So oftentimes I've read that Ketu drives someone towards moksha or liberation. And I would say in a lot of ways that is true. And what I mean by that is, so early in life, an individual is functioning through Ketu, meaning what you are born with, right? The sort of gifts, the skills that are kind of happening for you innately at birth. And then at a certain point, as you get more mature, you start to function more like Rahu, or the head without a body, and that becomes more of a focus in life. So it's kind of what you're moving toward, or your focus in life is kind of what represented by the North Node or Rahu. So Ketu is eventually, we sort of rediscover it, because this is where liberation or moksha is found, is when we start to essentially surrender through meditation, through some sort of spiritual path. We learn to connect to the inherent gifts that we have in this lifetime, to better utilize those gifts, because we're developing objectivity. Now, objectivity is incredibly important here from Mula, and I'll get into that in a moment. But keeping in mind with this idea that liberation happens through the rediscovery of Ketu later in life. And again, Ketu is more associated with our genetics, our body. So, and this is when we start to sort out the karmas from past lives, etc., etc. And it's through that process that we stop operating on impulse, because Ketu is all about impulse. It's about autopilot. And Mula is very much about autopilot, as was Ashwini, which is at the beginning of Aries, as is Magha, which is at the beginning of Leo. Both of those are ruled by Ketu. So the goddess who rules this particular nakshatra is called Nriti. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, but that's how I pronounce it. So Nriti is this goddess of this destructive goddess, right? So I have some other terms written down here if you can find it. Dissolution, destruction, calamity. All right, doesn't sound good, right? Well, again, this is more about early in life, Ketu, right? Going back to impulse. So Mula is represented by roots. Okay, so Mula basically means root. It also means, in some ways, one's center. It means the core of something. But in this case, we're going to kind of look at it more as sort of like the roots. And it's something that actually is kind of specific. And I think one of the other symbols I saw associated with was, yes, roots, but it was bundled roots. The idea of bundled roots is this idea that there's a great deal of focus here, right? So the roots are bundled, so the energies are not so dispersed. So Mula's got this like focus, right? So there's this tunnel vision that happens with Mula. So most, well, going back to this idea of calamity and this idea how K2 evolves, is that so Mula is actually kind of a prosperous placement. It's the 19th nakshatra, right? So the 19 is this sort of pinnacle of material success in a lot of ways. It's a very, very good number. And not only that, but it falls under Sagittarius, which is kind of a lucky place, right? So because it's ruled by Jupiter. And so I keep thinking, like, why is all this negativity? Well, again, it goes back to Mula needing to make some choices. I'm going to get into those choices a little bit when I get into the first pada, because that represents the choice at its deep core. But first off, let me kind of like say a little something more about Mula. Being that it's at the beginning of Sagittarius, this is the beginning of the spiritual impulse, right? So as I mentioned, I think I mentioned before anyway, I'm kind of forgetting things here, but is that, so the previous divisions of the nakshatras, you have 3 divisions. You have the first 9 nakshatras have Rajasic energy at their base, meaning it's sort of about exploration, right? It's activity and exploration, and you go out and I want this, I want that. So it's about attaching to things and grabbing things and moving towards things, right? So again, think about exploration, curiosity, etc. So the first 9 nakshatras are functioning in that way. The second 9 nakshatras are tamasic at their base, meaning they're anchoring into the material. So things slow down then, and you start to focus on the material plane. You kind of get a better idea of what it is specifically that you want to achieve materially, and it's less about the exploration. I'm not saying these folks are not exploratory, but the second 9 nakshatras are really about establishing a material base. So the third 9 nakshatras are spiritual in nature, meaning the spiritual impulse. I think about, life's purpose, right? So when somebody talks about like, oh, what do you do for a living versus life's purpose? What you do for a living would be kind of more, sort of tamasic or material in nature, meaning like you're just earning money in order to establish your life on the material plane so you can have a house, et cetera, et cetera. Now, when spiritual impulse comes into it, we're talking about purpose or mission. So I tend to think of Mula as the beginning of purpose or mission, which requires discernment, objectivity, and again, all those things that we need to sort of transcend the impulsiveness that comes along with K2. And again, sort of moksha, liberation, also lies with K2. So because once we transcend the impulsiveness, we learn to slow it down, we can then start to meditate, and you start to work through the past karmas that are associated with K2, and also start to realize the gifts that K2 brings. All right, so a little bit more here is that, keeping in mind this is at the beginning of Mula, the beginning of Sagittarius, and something interesting about Sagittarius energies is that since it's the beginning of Sagittarius, we're talking about immature Sagittarius. And what I mean by that is that Jupiter, it's supposed to be lucky and this thing and that thing. They say all these very positive things about Jupiter, but Jupiter is also arrogant, high-minded, and, can be hypocritical. So we're going to see some of those energies here in Mula. High-mindedness, hypocrisy, overeagerness, etc. And again, that's when it's functioning through its lower self or more egoically. Okay, so hopefully all that kind of makes sense. Now, going into the padas specifically, this to me is where it gets quite interesting, in that, again, keeping in mind that I want you to keep in mind something here is this idea of roots. All right, so just keep this in the back of your mind about Mula. Roots. Roots are medicinal, right? So you could even think of like Mula as being scientific. It's also, roots are hidden, right? So we're looking at hidden, could be like the occult, right? So you could see Mula having, if it's either about looking at material things that are hidden, so you could say science, bacteria, viruses, medicines, things that you kind of have to discover and find out how they work and function, which requires that, again, a lot of focus, a lot of experimentation, a lot of tunnel vision. But if the evolutionary path is spiritual in nature, this deep probing could, because that's the first pada here, is ruled by Mars, which implies more kind of intense activity and, again, deep probing, really going into things. So this deep probing, this kind of enthusiasm of going into things, if the evolutionary path is spiritual in nature, you could see these individuals going towards spirituality. You could see them going towards, yoga, tai chi, qigong, meditation, in a very intense way. I mean, I could see very monk-like behavior happening here, because, again, there is a tendency to sort of have a little bit of self-centeredness here. So, and I'm not saying monks are self-centered, but if I were to guess where I would see an ascetic in life, someone who totally cuts themselves off from society in a lot of ways and totally dives deep into, say, meditation or retreat, I would see it here, I think. And there could be a very deep emotional need, the fourth pada ruled by the moon, and I'll get to that in a moment, a deep emotional need to do this. Again, because it's ruled by Ketu, so there's this need to sort of slow the impulse and to meditate and to find that objectivity, and sort of work through the past karmas so that one can be liberated. So deep probing is Mars, first pada. Choice is very important here. Are we going to deeply probe into the material, or are we going to deeply probe into the spiritual? That's what, again, that depends on evolutionary path and one's desires in a lot of ways in life. Now, going into this idea of desire, we have the second pada, which is ruled by Venus. I wrote down hard work, art, and music. Those are kind of cliche Venus things in a lot of ways. But for me, this is, it kind of speaks of a further grounding into the material in some ways. So I see less of the spiritual impulse here and more the material focus, more of the sort of desiring material things. I tend to think of Venus as a very sort of magnetic kind of energy. And Mula in and of itself, Mula's been described as magnetic in a way, attractive. But again, we're not talking about physical attraction. Like if your ascendant is in this position, it says, one of the books I have anyway says that you're not necessarily going to find attractive people. They talk about big noses, kind of like big noses, etc. With this particular placement. So it's not necessarily traditionally attractive, but they're magnetic, right? So to me, that's because of the Venus energy here. And the other thing to keep in mind is that in terms of the overall spiritual evolutionary path of Mula, Mars, Venus, Mercury, Moon, these are fast-moving planets. So Mula's evolutionary path is fast. And actually, a lot of the energies about Mula is fast, impulsive, right? Overeager. So again, I keep reflecting on this idea, the need to slow down and meditate, right? And again, go deep into it. So the third pada is ruled by Mercury. So we're talking about Gemini kind of energy here. This is where Mula has the ability to discern, right? So once they slow it down, because they keep causing destructive things and calamities, right? Mula, as well as the nakshatra that's opposite on the other side of the zodiac, Ardra, it's all this, destruction kind of energy. But with Mula, to me, it's not. To me, it's about destruction for rebirth purposes, right? You're going to destroy what is not necessary. If it's not necessary, because Mula keeps going deep and deep and deep and deep and deep, it needs to push away what is not necessary, right? The sort of the extraneous aspects in life, that which is not needed. Again, that could be positive or negative. If one's impulsive, immature, it can cause some very destructive tendencies to oneself or others. So hence, that's why there tends to be a lot of negative talk around Mula. I don't see it as a negative energy necessarily, but again, the need here is meditation. I'll say it 1,000 times. So under the third pada, I wrote intellect, light, and balance. So, well, what I mean by light is levity, right? So there's a lightness here. Mercury inherently is light, right? So I know a lot of people, again, when I tend to think of Mercury, I think of prototypical Gemini like disposition. So to me, Geminis always have a lightness to them, and in terms of their ability to kind of like look at this or that and to kind of like be discerning, which requires, again, objectivity and the ability to kind of float above things a little bit. So you're going to get a little bit of that energy here if you are a native born into the third pada. Balance, I put down balance, and the reason is, again, because Mercury kind of shows you this or that, right? So it's this or that. And again, if you slow down that K2 energy, that impulsiveness, you slow it down and you can choose this or that. Now, what are they choosing? Spiritual or material? Mula is so close to Jyeshta Nakshatra, which is the previous nakshatra at the end of Scorpio, which is kind of the pinnacle of the sort of material path in a way, right? So it's the end of the material fixity. So now Mula has kind of already been there, done that in terms of an evolutionary energy, and now it's applying this idea of purpose. Now, purpose needs spirit, and the understanding of spirit and intuition, right? So I forgot to mention the second pada also could lend the individual a sense of feeling, which means ultimately leading into intuition. So that being said, and also Mars, first pada, you could also add to Mula instinct, right? So instinct and intuition are kind of guiding factors here potentially. And so essentially the intuition and the instinct that Mula has capacity to access, as well as the high-mindedness that's lent to it by the sort of Sagittarian energy in Jupiter, what it can achieve here is a balance between the material and the spiritual, right? That is, if they don't go off overboard into one or the other, right? So that, because again, that is the possibility here, is to go totally into the spiritual or totally in the material here. So, but with that third pada, you might be able to find some balance there. So that's excellent. Fourth pada. This is where Mula gets uncomfortable. We have an emphasis on the emotions and the emotional needs here. A lot of rambunctious energy here with Mula, a lot of like go kind of juice going on, and nervous energy, etc. And so when the emotions are running high and the sort of I would say with the fourth pada, there's a potential of emotions becoming scattered, which in some ways goes against Mula's nature, which is to dig deep into something. So I wrote down emotional sacrifice for higher goals, okay? So the need here, again, is to slow down, right? Slow down and to sort of look at, again, to discern what are the higher goals. And again, philosophy, purpose, these words keep coming up. And again, sort of spirituality is to link the energy that Mula has, this intensity on when it comes to material things. They need to link it to spirit, intuition, instinct, so that they can then realize purpose and what's truly for them to investigate, right? This sign is so much, this nakshatra, is so much about investigation, diving into things, going to the root of it, finding the core of things. This is the energy, it's right at the galactic center, the point of birth for our solar system in a lot of ways, but it rose out of the void, out of the darkness. So, and again, in a lot of ways, that sort of, that void, the void is kind of, there's some dark energy with Mula, and again, but it's ultimately the light that comes out of the darkness. So, with all that said, I do read astrology charts if you like your chart read, and it's actually a very gratifying process for me. So if you would like your chart read, please reach out. I have my website posted down below the video. And yeah, so with all that said, and also I should say that I tend to focus on the soul when I do my astrology chart readings. I'm not overly focused on sort of material achievement and things of that nature, but anything that might lead to one's realizations in life in terms of like soul's fulfillment. So yes, that could be career, that could be your relationships, sex and sexuality are big topics for me. So anyway, with all that said, thank you for watching.